Good morning. Thank you for joining us for the Office of Equity and Inclusion's webinar on data literacy and equity, which is offered as part of OEI's competency series. My name is Dr. Priyank Shah, and my pronouns are he, him, and his. I serve as the Interim Assistant System Diversity Officer in the Office of Equity and Inclusion. I'm joined by three wonderful colleagues who will be co-presenting and co-facilitating this presentation and training. I welcome each of them to introduce themselves, beginning with Terence Robertson.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Terence Robertson, he, him, his, and I'm the project director in the Office of Equity and Inclusion. Nicole, go ahead.
I am Nicole Peterson. I am the Interim Associate Vice President of Academic Operations at Century College.
Fantastic. Ron? I think Ron is here. Ron, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Ron Ferguson. I'm one of the Equity and Inclusion Coordinators at Min State. I work at Ridgewater College in sociology. Thank you.
Welcome to a fellow sociologist. As you'll see that there are a handful of other panelists as well who are part of our efforts and our team at OEI. They may jump in at times to offer some thoughts and share some discussion or help address a particular question that may come up. So we welcome our additional colleagues and panelists as well. And we certainly welcome all of you in the digital audience to this event. So during our time together, we'll be focusing on building capacity for data literacy, with a particular emphasis on leveraging data to advance equity and stakeholder outcomes. I imagine for many of you, as you hear the phrase data literacy, what comes to mind are visions of reading meticulously crafted data tables that display a riot of numbers, and visions of multicolored graphs that dynamically visualize equity data. Those would be reasonable things to think of when data literacy is mentioned. Our discussion today, however, will not closely be looking at tables and focusing on interpreting data. I recognize some of you are disappointed and others are asking in bewilderment, how can we possibly talk about data literacy without looking at data? Well, the short answer is, before we can take the steps of looking at data and teasing out the all too important patterns that matter for equity, we must take several earlier steps in the data literacy journey. We need to begin the data literacy journey by considering, how do we foster the circumstances and conditions that allow for meaningfully looking at and discussing data, which is a critical step in the process for advancing equity. Our discussion today will focus on those important foundational elements on which data-informed equity strategies and efforts are built upon. Now, in full disclosure, as we were preparing for the competency series, we realized that the data literacy and equity topic will require more than one webinar. So let us welcome you to part one of the data literacy and equity competency series. Next slide, please. Oh, no, you can stay there. Before heading into the main content of the webinar, it is important to highlight some qualifiers and provisos about today's data and equity discussion. First, please note, while much of our discussion will focus on equity and student success outcomes, the elements we will discuss are also applicable to advancing equity and employee outcomes. Please also note, many of the considerations that are going to be put forward in our presentation are tied to the Office of Equity Inclusion's Equity by Design framework. It is important to bear in mind that many of the elements we will discuss are also relevant to other conversations and directions for building a culture of data literacy that aims to advance and support equity. That is to say, the content applies to EBD and beyond. Another important consideration is the use of the term data. While much of this conversation today will focus on quantitative data, it is important that we recognize data also refers to evidence, which can be in the form of quantitative, qualitative, and material evidence. And lastly, a fair number of you are undoubtedly seasoned practitioners of institutional research, statistics, and equity and inclusion professionals. Much of what we cover today will be familiar to you. We encourage you to consider how the elements of today's discussion can help further inform, refine, or enhance your efforts and engagement of colleagues that are seeking to navigate the twin journeys of data literacy and equity. Having covered those opening remarks, let us turn our attention to the importance of data equity efforts. Let us begin with an opening exercise. So we're going to pose a question on the screen here. How comfortable are you working with data? And I'm going to ask Terence to open up a poll and facilitate this part of the conversation while we think about this question.
Yeah, we see.
Go ahead, please.
We see people are already responding. I just opened it up. So take a second, reflect on that, and think about, are you really comfortable working with data? Somewhat comfortable, not really used to working with data? What's that level of comfort like for you? So we'll keep this open for a few more seconds. We already have about 85% people completed it. And what we see coming through so far, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share. We see between very comfortable, even somewhat comfortable, and not a whole lot of folks are in that slightly comfortable or not comfortable realm. So, I mean, clearly a wide breadth of experience and comfort working with data. So as Dr. Shah had mentioned, if some of these things are really familiar to you, consider, how you can help your other colleagues advance their data literacy and engage in more deeper, meaningful conversations around working with data. And hopefully our discussion today will provide you with some of that context to set you up for just that. Anything you want to add, Dr. Shah?
Absolutely. This is a pretty loaded question, and it's likely to bring up a lot of questions for some of our audience members, right? What does comfortable mean in the context of data? Yeah. And what does working with data even mean? Does it mean working in the application of inferential statistics or building regression models? Or does working with data mean discerning patterns from data presented to us? And also, what data are we specifically talking about? There's a lot of elements to this question. This short and seemingly simple question helps demonstrate the complexity of leveraging data in our work. We cannot simply jump into looking at data. There are several considerations and foundational steps that shape data literacy, of which one is the importance of having shared language and definitions. And with definitions in mind, I'm going to pass the presentation to Terence to provide some critical foundational information that is extraordinarily important for our equity efforts and for today's presentation.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Dr. Shah. So as he had mentioned, there's some key terms and concepts that we have to be on the same page about. We have to have common understanding of some of these key terms and concepts, because when we have that, it helps us be on the same page and prevent any misunderstandings, because there's nothing more frustrating than if you're in a room having a conversation using the same terms, but you have vastly different ideas of what those terms mean. That can quickly lead to derailing a conversation or leaving you feel frustrated. So with that, I'm going to cover a couple of the key terms as we understand them. And you can see the picture on the right as our terms of equity and inclusion. We have a variety of tools available that go beyond just these terms if you want to dig deeper. So that's available on the Office of Equity and Inclusion website. But the first term I want to start with is data literacy. And I've included a couple of different definitions, and I would consider these more simplistic definitions of data literacy. And there's certainly many other components of data literacy for people whose primary roles and responsibilities include working with data on a day in and day out basis, analyzing data, et cetera. And in this case, understanding analytical methods, different data techniques, all of those things are certainly relevant. And there's also several different frameworks that highlight the different levels of what we would consider data literacy competency, but we're not going to get into that today. What I want to hone in on, though, is this last definition, because it really speaks to me when I think about being data literate, right? It says the ability of non-specialists to make use of data. And I'm a non-specialist. I am not a Dr. Shah. I do not have an IE background. But if I were, in my own words, to describe what I think data literacy means, I would say that it's our ability to use data to drive inquiry and help us shape our understanding so that we can apply what we're seeing and make data-informed decisions. So that's how I, as a layperson, would think about being data literate. The next key term I want to talk about is equity, because it's something that you hear often. I mean, it's in the title of the webinar, right? Equity has a very strong and distinct meaning, but people have a tendency to confuse it with equality. Now, equity differs from equality in that equality implies that everybody is treated equally and everyone's experiences are exactly the same. But when we think about equality, it doesn't bring into consideration or even acknowledge, for that matter, that individuals and groups are dissimilarly situated. They don't have the same starting points. And when we think about being equitable, that means that we have to acknowledge and address those structural inequities, both historic and current, that have a tendency to advantage some groups while simultaneously disadvantaging others. And equal opportunity or equal treatment results in equity only if everybody starts with equal access to opportunities. So what does it mean, when we say, when does equity happen? What does that mean? Equity is realized when there are similar outcomes for groups, regardless of their background or sociodemographic characteristics. So for example, let's say we're looking at graduation rates between groups. We could say between white, Black, and Latinx students, and we were to observe that there's very notable differences in their graduation rates. Then we could say that there isn't parity between those groups. The differences in the graduation rates signifies that there is a need for us to work toward realizing greater equity in the outcomes of those groups. And in order to do that, in order to realize equity, we have to critically assess our institutional policies and practices at all levels. And we have to redirect resources where they're needed so that we can address some of those structural barriers. So that's what realizing equity means. The next two concepts I want to touch on are deficit-mindedness and equity-mindedness. Now, these might be new terms to you, or maybe it's something that you've heard before. But we all know that inequities exist, right? But when people explain these inequities, they often have a tendency to explain them using deficit-minded thinking. And what I mean by that is that we have a tendency to think things like students have a lack of preparation as the main reason for disparities, or they don't exhibit the qualities of what they think a successful college student should have, right? This deficit-mindedness can take many forms, but often takes a form of perceiving shortcomings, or what we perceive shortcomings to be, as a result of things like socioeconomic status, or attending under-resourced K-12 schools, students not being motivated. You can see a whole host of examples here that are deficit-minded. But it also makes people believe that these factors are natural and that they're a natural outcome of the student's background, and that we must fix our students or make them assimilate to the dominant campus culture in order to succeed. And we have this line of thinking, this deficit-minded thinking. It obfuscates the role of higher education in our institution in producing racial inequities. Now, do students play a role in their academic outcomes? Yes, without a doubt, right? But deficit-mindedness places that responsibility for change directly on the students. And now conversely, equity-mindedness, on the other hand, emphasizes how it is that our institutions are playing a role in shaping or contributing to the disparities that we see. So this equity-minded thinking enables us to reframe our understanding and to engage in some direct actions to improve our policies and engagement and practices to impact student success. And it's this reframing, again, that's equity-mindedness. And we think about being equity-minded, it means we have to recognize that we have a historical context of exclusionary practices and historical racism within higher education, and to understand how these things contribute to the inequities that we see, how it is that our policies and interactions and engagement impact our students and continue to shape those disparities. So these are just a couple of terms that I want us all to understand when we discuss topics centered around equity. And again, I'd encourage you to use the terms of reference. We have other guides, tools, and training available through the Office of Equity and Inclusion to help deepen your understanding in these areas. And now Dr. Shah is going to move us into discussing the importance and the role of data.
Thank you, Terence, for walking us through those critical terms that we'll be using several times. And again, we encourage you on your campuses and in your own work to visit these definitions and reflect on them in terms of how do you understand equity or student deficit-mindedness or equity-mindedness. Before jumping into the content of the slide, I'd like to encourage our attendees and our colleagues to share their thoughts and ideas through the through the chat function, as well as Terence, are we going to use the Q&A module?
Yes, yeah, please. And you can use either the Q&A or the chat, whatever works best for you.
Okay, but we do encourage exchange in the chat, because it's always nice to hear the thoughts and perspectives and ideas and questions of our colleagues. So going into the importance of data. Why is data important for us and for our work? One response is that data can help us make things better. I want to emphasize the word help, because while data can help us in the process of bringing about improved outcomes, the data by itself cannot make things better. Simply having the data is not going to provide understanding or the meaningful approaches for addressing inequities in student or employee outcomes and their experiences. Simply having and looking at the data is tantamount to the notion of just admiring the problem. So we have to think about, how can data help us improve the outcomes and experiences of our stakeholders? And again, to put it simply, data is evidence that reflects the outcomes and experiences of our stakeholders. To put it another way, data helps us see what is going on or happening with our students and colleagues. While we may anecdotally know or at some level be aware of troubling patterns in outcomes, particularly for our students, data can help elucidate and help us better see what we may know anecdotally. It can also help reveal something that we are not aware of or tuned into. Next slide, please. Data is very helpful and is very useful in telling us a story. How to tell a story using data or reading the story from a table or graph and discussing that story are very much elements of data literacy. With regard to equity, data serves as an important role in that telling of story around disparities. More specifically, disparities in the outcomes and experiences of our students and employees. The disparity story is revealed and told by disaggregating the data. Next slide, please. So what does that mean? Simply put, disaggregation takes an outcome that is presented for an entire stakeholder group, such as students, and breaks out the data to look at the outcomes for various groups. This process begins with the outcome for all students lumped together. The story there is relatively straightforward, but what are we not seeing? What are we missing when we look at just the entire group together? Advance, please. Disaggregation presents the outcomes for the constituent subgroups that make up the larger group. When we disaggregate the data, the story becomes more complex and reveals that there are disparities in the outcomes between groups. Those groups often are sociodemographic populations and identities that are of interest to us in education, such as race, ethnicity, gender, age, first-generation college goer, socioeconomic background, and other identities. For equity efforts, data is critical for elucidating and revealing differences in outcomes across student populations. Again, this aggregation helps tell the story of how disparities are patterned in the outcomes of our students and employees. Next slide, please. I'm starting here on the fourth bullet. Disaggregation of data also allows us to view disparate outcomes between groups and look at the gaps through an equity-minded lens, which asks us, as Terence has already mentioned, to think about how our practices shape or exacerbate the disparate outcomes. Bringing about greater equity requires us to look at equity gaps and ask questions that help us understand how and why the disparate outcomes take shape. Seeing the disparity should prompt us to ask, how can we make things better? For our equity efforts, it is important to remember the real value of the data lies in the discussions that accompany looking at the disparity patterns present in the data. So it's not the data by itself that is of great value, it is the discussions and engagement of the information that the data presents that is of great value. Next slide, please. We'd like to now shift gears a little bit and offer our two colleagues and co-presenters, Ron and Nicole, to share their thoughts about the importance of data. So we'll begin with Nicole.
Thanks, Priyank. There was a lot that was unpacked just at the beginning of this. So I've been working hard to try and organize my thoughts as we went through. I saw some great comments in the chat as well about data being more than just numbers. And I think we're going to explore that in more depth throughout the rest of this presentation. But, Eva, you're right on with that what we need to keep an eye on as we're going through this is that the data is simply part of the story that we're crafting. And it's not something to be taken in a vacuum. It's not something to look at in isolation. It is something that is an incredibly important part of the discussion, but is meant to be used to help craft this overall picture. So data by itself is not a silver bullet. We're not going to be able to pull any report that is going to tell you exactly what to do and to fix all problems. If we could, I assure you, Priyanka and I would have done that a long, long time ago.
We wouldn't have jobs.
That's true as well. But we have sold the idea and be living on some beautiful island somewhere, But what it can do, though, is help you on your path to try and address those concerns that we all have, that you're seeing, anecdotally in the classroom day to day or with your services day to day. And this data can help refine that to help provide you a means to move forward, so to address those issues. Like I said, we'll get into this a little bit more in detail as we go forward. So I'll hand off to Ron.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nicole, I couldn't agree more. The data is more than just numbers, and it does tell a story. And from a faculty member's point of view, so me and my colleagues who are teaching day to day, we actually use a lot of data in terms of our classroom assessment and other ways in which we deliver information to our students for helping them develop, but also the opportunity for us to utilize data in a way that can help sort of create that positive change throughout not only our class, but our institutions. And there's three ways that really stand out to me that data can be really helpful and important from a faculty, from a teaching perspective. One is that the data we utilize can move beyond abstractions, right? When we think of data, we look at system-wide data, or we look at maybe even campus or college-wide data, and that gives us some lens. And in some ways, that allows, maybe there could be a distance from the data. That data, can distance us in some way, and it moves us to suggest and recognize that this is something that is also happening in my course, in my department and program, and what are we going to do together collectively? Not about blaming. I'll talk more about some of the fears that come along with utilizing data later, but it's about suggesting that this data can be something that we can understand as something that is also local, being part of the whole. And it's really recognizing that it happening in our spaces, that there's also opportunities for change, right? So once we have data and can create some baselines about equity and gaps, I see these as opportunities for colleagues to suggest, well, what kind of things are we going to do? One thing I emphasize about the use of data in terms of creating equity and inclusion is that there should be no one-shot data or assessment, that we don't do one test or one thing to get data and get information and say, okay, we created a whatever it be, a climate survey, data about student performance or achievement in classes, what have you, and say we've done. No, but rather that this is beyond a one shot, but a consistent culture of assessment where we're allowing folks to utilize the data to tell those stories that really does what? Allows for continual growth, that we can see, are we making changes for the outcomes of our students? And to me, it's an essential piece that, if done correctly, has a real potential to when we throw around the word transformative, right? But I think that if we do it the right way, it really can be transformative. And so, yeah, excited to be here. Back to you, Priyanka.
Thank you so much, Nicole and Ron, for offering those campus level perspectives. And just to add a little bit of information, Ron is offering us that faculty perspective, but he is also a partner in this work as an equity and inclusion coordinator. So he has the ability to put on a couple of different lenses to look at this work. Nicole is offering the all extraordinarily important view of somebody that helps lead this work or strategically advance this work at the campus level through her background in IR and IE, but also now as leading challenging administrative functions, the academic affairs realm. So we really value the perspective and ideas brought forward by our campus colleagues. And again, we welcome the attendees to share their ideas through the chat. We'd like to open up the floor to some Q&A. Well, actually, I apologize about that. I'm skipping here. This slide simply represents just some of the big key takeaways of what was just discussed. We're not going to go through this in depth, but I want to highlight a couple of things. Data helps us tell a story. So please remember, data helps tell the story. Data itself is not the main story. And disaggregating data helps us see and acknowledge disparities, which is, again, critical for advancing on that equity journey. We want to take some time now for open discussion and questions. So, Terence, could we stop the screen share and invite the audience to pose questions? And we also welcome Ron and Nicole and our other panelists to share any thoughts they would like to bring forward on this question of why is data important and why is data important for equity?
I'll jump in if it's okay. There was a question that came up in the chat that I think that's really important to think about with regard to using data, because we oftentimes think of data, at least from my role as an educator, as a sociologist, I think of, data being used, of learning, right, in the classroom, or of learning of whatever outcomes, but also data is used for learning. And I think that the way I use data, particularly as we think about equity by design and other forms of being data literate in terms of what's happening, is when I hear that story, what can we learn, as faculty or staff, what can we learn from the data that can move us towards that continuous improvement? So it's not just of learning, again, speaking from my faculty hat, but it's also for learning in terms of continuous improvement towards equitable outcomes. So that's just one thing I wanted to say. And thank you for bringing that up in the chat.
There's a question that has come up, and we know this is an important part of this conversation, is what about the qualitative data? Our colleague is thinking about the anecdotal data from students, and this helps them know that things have to change. So Ron, Nicole, just from your experience, how have you seen qualitative data help inform that continual growth and advancement towards improvement, but also in the context of equity? And this is particularly in the context of our students.
Qualitative data it is not used often enough. I mean, I'll be the first to say that, even as an IR professional, because of the time it takes in order to do it right, collect the information, clean it, be able to draw conclusions from it. But it's something that, would be great if we could explore more deeply. And I just want to say, anecdotal, when we use that word, it becomes kind of a way to be super dismissive, right? To be like, oh, that's just an anecdote. Let's not think of it that way. Even anecdotal data is still a type of evidence, right? It's one type. That's why we need many different points of data, many different types of evidence in order to form a full picture. Getting the information from students is a challenge for even larger institutions with larger IR offices, but there are opportunities to collaborate with faculty in order to leverage the spaces that we have, or students are naturally congregating already, in order to gather some of that information. So I won't be long-winded on this, but, well, I probably will, but I'll try not to. A project that we were working on pre-COVID was working with a group of faculty in order to do a type of ethnographic study where we are collecting qualitative data specifically around how students understand what success is to them by doing some simple sort of card sorting tactics, which we won't get into in any detail today. But it's a robust tool. It allows the students an activity. It's a very engaging sort of tactic. And as I was talking to the faculty, and I was saying, this will be great for me, but this will be great for you too, because there's often that conversation, particularly at community colleges, of what is success. For some students, success at that moment is just passing their math class. Like, that is for them the big success. And they haven't yet even thought as far as graduation. Right now, they just want to get through and successfully pass this math class. They want to get through this semester while balancing a certain workload with their life. And getting more of that and getting a better picture of what our students want and need. Often we need qualitative data to do that, because it's a free space for the students to tell us, because surveys, things of that nature, all come from our voice. no matter how careful we are in crafting those survey questions, they're still framed in our voice, especially if they're multiple choice. We already limit, right, the amount of options and the amount of words that they can select to reflect their own experience. So absolutely, qualitative data is extremely important, but it's also recognizing needing to find collaborative ways to do it, because it is extremely difficult to put to any IR office or any one person, any one faculty member in general, to say, you know, collect this robust body of data, clean it, pull insights from it, and share it with the college community, because it is a great deal of work, but an important source of information.
Thank you, Nicole. Ron, I don't know if you want to share, please.
Yeah, I did. You know, again, at risk of sounding like, yeah, I agree. I think with Nicole, qualitative data is necessary. Look, I'm just to be honest, we don't know what we don't know. A lot of people that I write surveys, I do this kind of work, and until I'm really listening to students, right? I'm giving a perspective of what I think in the survey questions I write and the quantitative data that I'm trying to get at. And I found that going and asking students about their experience, about barriers and opportunities, you know, it really reframes the kind of questions I might even ask a campus community, right? And that's an integral component that we almost, to some points in the chat, we almost need to do this as part of, right? Not as the nice to have, but really an essential part of the cycle of research, right? And in the scholarship of teaching and learning, we have to have both qualitative and quantitative. You know, one thing though that I think there needs to be as just an add to this is a bit of an ethic that goes along with it, that, for example, when we do qualitative research and pull students in, an example I'll give is I worked with a focus group of students of color who were first generation coming to a campus, and in that focus group we glean data. And one thing I always think about when I'm getting this data is when I'm asking students about their experience and perspective, what is the promise that I'm willing to, what am I doing with it, right? What are we doing? Are we collecting data for posterity just because it's something we do? Are we collecting this data because we're going to actually utilize it in ways and making sure they know that, right? Share your story, share your story, share your story, and then gets filed. That's something we see so often. And it's heartbreaking, to be quite honest. And instead of that, let's get that qualitative data, but doing it in a way together that really ensures that those stories are utilized with the purposes that we said, hey, we're going to use this to create some changes. Well, then let's make sure that happens. And that's one aspect of the qualitative that I really just wanted to emphasize, that we need to do it more and we need to do it right.
Greatly appreciate this deep conversation on the importance of looking at multiple forms of evidence. And there's other pieces that I would want to go into, but in the interest of time, I want to shift our conversation just a touch. I'd like to invite our colleague Tabitha Reese-Miller from System Office IR to share just briefly a couple of thoughts about the different forms and packaging of data. Tabitha?
Yeah, so I think one thing that is not necessarily intuitive to all education professionals is the difference between asking a formative evaluation question versus a summative evaluation question, and how you look at the data and how you evaluate the data is different depending on which of those questions you're trying to answer. And so for a formative evaluation question, we're actually asking questions about how can we do things better in terms of our processes, what about either this initiative or our systems can we change, versus a summative evaluation question, which is to say something like, you know, at the end of a implementation of some sort of change, how effective was the implementation that we participated in? So those are two different questions. One is on the back end to say, how do we evaluate the thing we did, versus a formative, which is sort of trying to inform the process as you go and trying to make process changes. And so the way you look at the data are different in both of those circumstances. And so when you're asking questions around data, it's important to think about which of these types of questions are you asking. Is it a formative or a summative? And that will help you, I think, generate the types of data points that you actually want to look at. And I think And this is particularly relevant when you're talking about qualitative versus quantitative data, right? Because the summative is actually a little bit more quantitative heavy. We can do a lot of things to figure out effectiveness or impact. But the formative is often questions that are better answered through a qualitative type of approach. We in research and IR across the system are often asked questions about, well, can we look at the data and see, like, did this actually help students? And the thing I always say is, if you want to know if this helped students or what the student experience was, the best thing to do is ask them. I can mine data out of our data systems all day long, but I'm not going to be able to tell you if this actually helps students. I can get all kinds of try to proxy indicators, and it's going to take me a lot longer, and the result is going to be much more questionable than if you just go directly to the student and ask them that question.
Thank you, Tabitha. Really appreciate that element, and I really appreciate what you're saying, because you are advancing the data literacy part of this conversation by bringing in those additional terms and questions about understanding a data point on the entry point or the early side, or discussing it on the impact or efficacy side. I just want to acknowledge, before we move on to the next part of our presentation, part two, today's part two, that is, there's several questions that are coming through about how do you assess and bandwidth, and we're going to have some lengthy discussion about gauging how do you lift this work and where do you start this work. So I promise some of the questions that have come through in the chat and the Q&A we are going to visit on as we advance in our conversation. That being said, we're going to go into part two about foundational elements and stage setting, right? Let's just start to get at these questions. So before actually getting our hands on data and looking at it, again, there are those key foundational aspects that must be considered in preparation for engaging data. We cannot jump into looking at and discussing equity gaps without laying the foundations that are instrumental to supporting those conversations. Next slide, please. I want to pause and shift gears for a moment. I want you and all of us to take a couple of moments and think about something that you may have experienced. I apologize, I think I've lost my place here. Okay, thank you. I want to pause and shift gears for a moment. I want you and all of us to take a couple of moments and think about something that you may have experienced where you jumped into an activity or endeavor and found yourself realizing that you were not ready for it. Does that sound familiar to you? Or can you think about something that you've done that is complex in nature and not easy, and how you had to think about planning for it or preparing for it? Now, this could be in the context of work or in your personal life outside of work. It is reasonable or feasible. Is it reasonable or feasible to realize success in a significant undertaking without some degree of preparation? I want to share on my end. Here are some non-work related examples of my own about jumping into something and not being prepared. I'm going to share just three very quick ones. Taking a really long bike ride in the countryside of an unfamiliar country before the advent of the smartphone and Google Maps. Taking on a do-it-yourself home project that I thought would be simple and knocked out in one afternoon, which may or may not remain unfinished even months later. And the third one, a quick one, hosting a holiday dinner party for 14 people and preparing the meal the day of the event with little experience in preparing such a large meal. While these are somewhat lighthearted examples, for all of them, a little planning, assessment, and preparation would have gone a long way. When it comes to data and equity work, preparation is a key step for laying the foundation on which your work will stand. As we've already discussed, data and equity can be challenging for many of us, particularly when we have limited experience with engaging in difficult conversations about equity. We need to be cautious of going from 0 to 60. We have to prepare to make use of data to inform our equity conversations. So what does it mean to prepare for undertaking data-informed equity work? What is involved in such an effort? This process begins with considering what does the starting point of the work look like for your college or university, as well as for yourself and your colleagues. Data and equity conversations are not one size fits all. Your approach to this work must fit the context of your campus and audience. So we begin by taking the quote unquote temperature of readiness to engage in both data discussions and equity discussions. We ask you to take a moment and consider why gauging readiness matters for you and your equity efforts. And you're welcome to share your thoughts in the chat. Next slide, please. Preparing for data-informed equity work, gauging readiness, and laying the foundation are critical steps for those of you who are playing lead and facilitating roles in your equity work. It is also important to note that these considerations are important for those of you participating or seeking to undertake equity efforts. As we move into sharing some key foundational steps and considerations, we want to note there are certainly other elements and details that inform your considerations and preparation needs. What we're going to share is not an exhaustive discussion for preparing and foundation laying. Again, we welcome you to share those additional thoughts in the chat. Next slide, please. As with many substantial undertakings aimed at improvement and change, we need to consider and understand what is it that we are seeking to do. What are the aims and objectives of our efforts? For many of us, assuredly, we can say we strive to make our system, colleges, universities, more equitable and inclusive and diverse spaces to study, work, and realize success. It is also important to consider, what does that mean for your efforts? What facet of your institution's practices or processes or facets of your own work do you seek to focus on in order to improve equity? Another key step is gauging your audience's experience and comfort with engaging data. Your approach will have to be mindful of the campus data culture and your stakeholders' comfort, history, willingness, and capacity for working with and discussing data. We will discuss this further during this webinar in terms of how do you gauge that. Laying the foundation for data and equity also entails assessing whether the conditions are conducive for your colleagues to engage in exchanges about challenging topics. The conditions in part are tied to having rapport and trust that allows for creating spaces that are conducive for exchange, right? And the exchange may entail vulnerability and being open to different approaches that can impact equity and student success. The foundational work takes time and often requires a group of colleagues to assess the conditions and lay the foundation together. Becoming comfortable with data and advancing data literacy does not happen in one go. It takes time. We must recognize for some of you and your colleagues, this can be at times frustrating because we feel a sense of urgency to realize equity. The urgency is good in terms of the desire and the motivation to bring about equity, but we also have to be cautious. Cautious in having urgency, which can translate to haste and rapidity. The foundational considerations and planning become extraordinarily important when race and ethnicity are brought into the data and equity conversations. This is a consideration that warrants special attention. As we move through the session today, we will further discuss the assessing of starting points for your work. But right now, let us turn our attention to the consideration of race. I'm going to pass the presentation to Terence.
All right, thanks, Dr. Shah. So as you can see on this slide here, I've got two different graphs, and these are mock graphs, and hopefully my IRIE colleagues aren't ripping their hair out looking at this saying, what the heck is this? But we've just got some really simplistic representations here. And what you'll notice is the graph on the left representing student course success, 100 level English, right? And you notice that the data is broken down to an aggregate level of URM or underrepresented minority. This could also be students of color instead of URM, and then that of white students. And then you have the graph on the right, again, mock data, but here we've disaggregated by race. And what we've observed is that it's a lot easier for people to engage in discussion around the graph on the left, the one where data is aggregated. And then when we get to disaggregating data, particularly around race, things start to get a little bit more complex. And what we've noticed is that when things like data and equity come together, there's more of a resistance to conversations about change, and that becomes significantly compounded. When we talk about race, it changes the dynamic of the conversation, and people have a tendency to become defensive or even flat out resist engaging in some of the deeper conversations for a multitude of reasons, which we're going to touch on a bit later. But this example here, while this is looking at student course success, this could apply to many different sources of data. So instead of looking at course success, let's say we were looking at employee retention rates for a particular division or department and disaggregating those by race, right? But when we look at aggregate level data, when we combine all people of color or those with marginalized identities into one category, it's problematic for a multitude of reasons, a few of which I'm going to touch on. And I'm also going to drop an article into the chat as a resource and a tool to add some additional context to this as a topic. And it's called The Misbegotten URM as a Data Point. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that or read it at a later time, but it's available for you online. I'm just going to pop that in here. There we go. But it also, it really informs some of the reasoning as well behind why we shouldn't look at data at a URM or aggregate level. Now, if we only disaggregate to that student of color or URM level, we're obscuring some of those profound and serious equity gaps that we can see in the data. And then also by aggregating all marginalized groups, it allows many of us to see our all non-white students or employees as a monolithic group that have no differences, which absolutely isn't true. But when we do this, it's dehumanizing. And Eva, I saw you put in the chat earlier about we have to humanize the people behind the numbers, right? These groups have long fought and continue to fight for their identity and for their voice. And when we aggregate again, it prevents us from engaging in those deeper, more meaningful conversations about why inequities exist. And if we're going to bring about greater equity, we have to be mindful of the fact that different groups have different histories, different circumstances and barriers that impact their outcomes and their experiences. And when we talk about focusing on race, this isn't saying that we can't focus on other sociodemographic groups, right? But we have to look at these other types of inquiry and equity separately, especially before introducing even more complexity into the equation, right? We have to understand these things on a more baseline level, because when we're talking about inequities based on race and ethnicity, these things stem from some very unique historical, sociocultural, and political circumstances in the United States. And this includes things like our history of enslavement, colonization, legacies of violence, and exclusionary laws and practices that are based on race. So when we're talking about racial inequity, we have to be mindful of the fact that these things are a direct result of the policies and systems that were not designed to benefit people of color, but rather to benefit the majority white population. And these legacies continue to have a profound impact today. We also notice that people have a lot more comfort talking about things like socioeconomic status, or they would rather talk about socioeconomic status instead of talking about race. One of the main reasons for this is that many white people can identify with being low income, right? It's easier to talk about, whereas they can't identify with being marginalized because of the color of their skin. So it's easier to talk about socioeconomic status. I've included a quote here that is from the Education Trust. They published a report in 2020 that was focused on policy and race in particular, right, within higher education. But I thought that this was certainly applicable to the need for focusing in on race. And I'm just going to read this. The main reason income, the most commonly used substitute for race and policies, does not result in achieving racial justice is because Black and white students and families with the same income often have vastly different experiences and circumstances that can affect their educational and financial outcomes. In 2017, there was also a recent study that was done from Consumer Finance that found that middle-income white households, for example, have 4 times the financial assets of Black middle-income households. So, given these things, given what I've just shared, it's yet another reason why we can't focus solely on socioeconomic status. And I have a bit of a reflection question. Now, let's say that you were to come up to a student in the hallway, a student of color, right? It doesn't matter what their race is. They could be Black, Latinx, Asian, it doesn't matter, but a student of color. Just by looking at that person, can you differentiate whether or not they are low income? Just by looking at them. No, you can't. But what can you see? You see race. Consciously and unconsciously, people make assumptions about ability, about background, potential, value, based on their own experiences, based on their own education and privilege and upbringing and a whole host of other factors. We all have these biases, and whether we realize it or not, these things show up in our interaction and engagement with students and colleagues, both inside and outside of the classroom. Now, do low-income students experience barriers to higher education? Without a doubt, absolutely. But when we're talking about students of color, they pay a cultural tax as a result of being burdened by the legacies of social and educational discrimination. Now, do I believe that our colleagues are intentionally trying to introduce harm? No, of course not, right? But again, these things show up, whether it's implicitly, explicitly, consciously or unconsciously, they show up. Now, back to the argument for a race-conscious approach. Now, I touched on this already, but it's important to reiterate that the differences in opportunity and outcomes for students, when we think about families of similar incomes but different races, it's the result of those inequities within education and the broader society. And these things start early, right? Long before people come to us. It starts in K through 12 with fewer resources for students of color. We have ongoing and pervasive segregation in schools, with schools being now more segregated than they were 30, 40, 50 years ago. Students of color experience more frequent and harsher discipline. There's discrimination in housing, employment, health disparities. I mean, a whole host of social factors, right? But these things also persist into higher ed with policies that have a disparate impact on students of color. We have a lack of racial diversity in faculty and staff, a lack of social and cultural supports on campus, a lack of culturally informed and relevant curriculum, ongoing trauma, and emotional exhaustion that impacts people of color and their ability to show up every day. So our students show up to our doors already not on equal footing, but yet we expect them to have the same opportunity and outcomes as their white peers, right? We're all getting the same education after all. But unless we have this deep understanding of the scope of the problem through racial disaggregation of our data, we can't begin to focus and direct the resources where they're needed so that we can change and disrupt our policies, our practices, our procedures, et cetera, to create that desperately needed systemic change. Think back to that definition of equity. And there's only a couple other things I want to touch on. So you might be thinking, okay, yeah, I get it, race matters, but what about other identities? Do the outcomes and experiences of other marginalized groups matter? Well, of course they do, without a doubt. We're not discounting that, and we do encourage deeper inquiry. Is there intersectionality among various identities? 100%. Those things are important to understand. But again, just because some of these things might be easier to discuss or understand, it doesn't mean that we can skirt around talking about race. And what we've also found, the more close to practice that the data are, the more challenging these conversations become, because at some level, it feels personal, right? Think back to those graphs on the first slide. What if that was your course data? Or what if that was your department's data looking at employee outcomes, et cetera? How does that make me look? There's a lot of fear associated with that. It's going to be uncomfortable. No doubt. We are coming from different perspectives and lived experiences. Think about what your baseline is. What is your understanding? Do some personal reflection. Think about how you've been shaped, educated, socialized to see things through a certain lens. And engaging these conversations requires you to be vulnerable, and to be okay with getting uncomfortable. It's going to happen. We have different identities, and it's difficult to have conversations across difference. But when we don't talk across difference, we're removing our ability to grow, both individually and collectively. We remove that opportunity to be challenged and understand others' experiences and perspectives, because we're all at different places in our equity journey, and we have to build trust among each other to engage in these conversations. We have to be informed by data, but also have an understanding of that history and those legacies that got us to this point, right? And last thing I'll say, you might be thinking, holy cow, that was a lot. So what the heck can I do, right? I mean, our students, if they're already showing up here on unequal footing or underprepared, quote unquote, deficit-minded thinking, by the way, how can we impact their outcomes? Now, in short, there's a lot we can do, but that isn't the focus of today's webinar. It's me making a shameless plug, Priyank, for some of our other training, like Equity by Design, right? But I want to invite my other colleagues, Ron and Nicole, to share some of their thoughts and perspectives and observations of the challenges in discussing things like race and racial equity. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share and invite you all to join.
Ron, I'll defer to you to start.
Thank you, Nicole. And also thank you, Terence, for that discussion about why this is such an important conversation for us in any area that we are within the system, educators, staff, IR, that this is such an important component. In many ways, it's one that many people, you know, I'm generalizing, but many people aren't always feeling so ready to talk about, right? Because I want to discuss three realities that I see with talking about race in and of itself, right? That is important. First thing, there is a notion that I hear from colleagues and friends. And by the way, when I say this, it doesn't mean that people don't want to confront issues of racism. They do, that people don't care about our students of different backgrounds. They do, but there is I think a hesitancy that I want to speak to. And that is, a lot of people just shy away because they feel race is a contentious issue. Either A, they just think, I don't feel equipped to sort of talk about, present, think about this in certain ways, and therefore let's not talk about it. Well, on the other end, there are folks that think we're post-racial, we're all people, let's not talk about race. But we need to recognize that I think this is kind of transformative to talk about race in and of itself, in that we are a racialized society where people see race. People see race. And these issues that our students are experiencing are real, they're happening right now. And for me, just if I could be a bit vulnerable, it's hard, right? Because I've just in my own life have experienced so many things in the state of Minnesota. One of my daughters tried to pull over for gas in Brainerd and someone called her the N-word and said, get out of my town. In my neighborhood, someone drove a car into a multiracial family's house, just right down the road from where I live, this last month. And August, rather, time has been flying. But these situations are all too real for me. And I have, thankfully, my daughter has a community of support, and I have the people that I can cry with and speak to, but it gets me to think about my students of color who may not have that support embedded, that are also going through their own crises, and with reality of the way in which people have different outcomes based on what they look like, people see race. And so talking about race in and of itself is recognizing the impact of racialization on people in our society, and that impact still happens, and just recognizing that. And also to the point that was made by Terence, that we conflate race and class and other aspects. When we do this, there is a fragmentation that will inevitably occur once we sort of create that leveling of marginalization. But we forget that even when we recognize that class matters, it's an issue, we forget that even when we do that controlling for class, there's still, if we didn't talk about race, we're fragmenting the unique experience of our students. That there is, even for students, regardless of who you are, there's a stereotype threat. I am worried when I'm pulled over in a car. It doesn't matter, Dr. Ferguson, whatever, I want to make sure that I'm not scary to people. I can't get mad at meetings. I have to control myself because of the fear of how I might be coded. And I think about students on my campus who, you know what they do in town? They wear their college gear because one, they're proud of their school, but two, they don't want to be coded as an outsider. They're fearful of how they're seen even in their own communities. So I think about the issues that race brings up that are distinct, that are different, right? That we have students that have that real feel. I did in grad school, this imposter syndrome. There was no one that looked like me, right? Neil deGrasse Tyson, as a physicist, said if I waited for anybody to be a symbol of a Black physicist, he would never have been one. He had to sort of overcome that. And I think about the unique experiences of students of color over and over again. Race allows us to sort of dial into those experiences. Why the qualitative matters, right? Stories matters, and it gives those numbers context to talk about race. But lastly, let me just think about it. I'll just think about it this way. And this is something that us and that utilize data and IR it resonates. when people think about issues of race, we tend to think about individuals, good and bad actors, right? We think about the situations of someone that is intended to be bigoted or prejudicial towards a group based on their identity or the experience. And really, when we look at the data on race, it isn't just about individual good or bad actors or intent. It's about impact and outcomes. And so to me, the allowing to talk about race broadly is a recognition that this is about systems that we can look at that have had negative impacts for people based on something like skin tone. That there is various issues that really, when I look at the 21st century workforce, this is something that is, one, a moral imperative, but two, for us as a state and as a system, if we're not looking at being inclusive, recruiting, retaining in our institutions, then we all will be really losing in the next few years. Because when I think about the 5.5 or so million Minnesotans, and I think about the students in our 30+ campuses, I think about the Minnesota of tomorrow, and that's who they are. And so there is a need to talk about this sort of enduring legacy of race, that we need to confront it for that moral good, but also that we recognize it is also for all of us if we're going to have a thriving society. It's the opportunity mindset that we need to change and flip the script about race that used to be this deficit mindset to say this is the opportunity to partner and invite in our fellow students of color. So thank you.
Ron, a heartfelt thank you and appreciation of your voice and your words. I know you were talking, so you were most likely not monitoring the chat, but your words were hitting home and resonating for a lot of folks. And I'll just say this on my end, the clothing piece, I continue to do that today. I don't go to the airport without wearing my Ohio State hoodie because I just want to get to the security line. And so you can talk smack to me about Ohio State and the Big Ten football and stave off the other scrutiny that will come through in the security line. So it's hitting home. And I hope our colleagues in the audience are hearing this, because we can't discuss data and equity without addressing and engaging the conversation of race, which again, we know is hard. We're going to move on pretty quickly to the next part, because we want to jump into some assessment pieces. We talked about how do you gauge readiness. So return to the foundation piece and stage setting for data literacy. We want to share some questions that help assess readiness. Now, a lot of these questions warrant attention, but we've also discussed many of them throughout the presentation already. In the interest of time, we're not going to discuss them here. Please know, as part of this effort to advance data literacy that is salient for equity efforts, the Office of Equity Inclusion will be making a toolkit available to you that facilitates the foundation laying and stage setting process. More to come on that, and that tool will be made available to you, I believe as of today, will be the first time we'll release it. There is one particular item on this list that we want to highlight, given its importance in gauging and understanding your and your colleagues' readiness. I want to draw your attention to the last item listed, which is going to be a big thrust of the remainder of our conversation, which is about understanding the concerns and apprehensions of your colleagues regarding data and equity work. So let's do a quick exercise. Let's together consider apprehensions. Terence?
So I'm going to open up a poll, and I want you to think about what are some of those apprehensions of your colleagues regarding working with racially disaggregated data. And you should be able to take your phone and go to your little camera app and scan that, and it'll open up on slido.com. But in this poll, I want you to, it's open text. Think about what are some of the apprehensions of your colleagues working with racially disaggregated data.
Terence, you may have to go back up one slide to show the QR code.
You got it.
I don't think it's visible.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and, you know how the PowerPoints work. It doesn't want to work properly when, there we go, when you want it to. So this might come through and look a little bit funny, but you should be able to see it here.
I also dropped in the slido.com URL and the code number to get into this particular activity. This is the joys of leveraging technology in the middle of a presentation.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think some of those apprehensions are of your colleagues working with racially disaggregated data? And we're going to take a minute here and allow you to get your responses in.
And if for some reason you're having trouble getting into the Slido, feel free to use the chat as well, but we would prefer that you did some Slido so we can all look at this together.
So a couple are coming through. They don't want to believe it's real. The ends are too low. They're outliers. They don't share lived experiences. Fear of being judged as a racist if gaps exist. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Feeling helpless. For white people, confronting our internal racism. You know, I've seen several times the word racist has come through in these responses. The data might highlight problems that we don't have answers to. Small ends is another one that I've seen coming through quite a bit. Concerns about the ends again, but it's really a fear of being exposed. I mean, that's a very vulnerable term. Fear of being exposed. It gets back to what I was saying earlier. You know, what is this going to say about me? You know, is this going to get blamed on me? At some level, it feels really personal. The problem's too big to solve, right? No clear action can be taken. I'm going to leave this poll open. So please continue. You know, if things are coming to mind, because you can submit more than one response, I'd encourage you to do so. But I want to move us forward to think about assessing campus readiness and a tool to assess campus readiness. So please continue to share your thoughts, and we're going to come back to these in just a few minutes as we talk about some common apprehensions to data and engaging in data.
Thank you, Terence. When you get a chance, please share the regular PowerPoint slide. So we've been talking about assessment activities, and we want to share one that's been adapted from the Equity by Design facilitation tool for navigating and engaging data discussions. And again, we'll be sharing that tool with you today. And it's the first version of this resource, and we'll be making it available to all our colleagues across Penn State. So using the abridged exercise, we want to consider engage your readiness to engage in data and equity conversations. Now, please note, these exercises are intended to help prompt consideration of what is your current entry point for engaging and leading data-informed equity work at your campus. The exercises in the toolkit aim to help facilitate your preparation. They are not intended to be psychometric instruments or other scientific assessment tools, right? These are tools for asking questions. So for the next few items that we're going to put up on the screen, take a couple of moments and consider where you think you and your colleagues fall on these scales. So for the first question, what is the comfort level with looking at and discussing data amongst your colleagues and for yourself? And where do you think you fall on this? The second question is, what is the comfort level between faculty and administrators in discussing difficult topics? Are your colleagues rather comfortable, or are they rather uncomfortable, or are they very comfortable? And again, where do you fall on this? And we know we're moving through this quickly, and that's because in the interest of time, we want to make sure we get to the next part of the conversation. All of these questions and the tool provide more information and guidance on how to navigate and leverage these exercises. What is the comfort level with willingness to discuss issues of race and inequity? Again, this is going back to the heart of the conversation. You have to assess this for your colleagues and for yourself. And depending on where you fall on those scales, you're going to have to shape how do you approach this. And so to that end, we approach this conversation by looking at it from a possibility of three large buckets of what is the entry point or level of preparation to engage this work. There's low comfort and willingness, followed by nascent or burgeoning comfort and willingness, and then moderate comfort and willingness. We're not going to go through, Terence, can you go back up on slide? We're not going to go through each one of these in depth, but we want to highlight key themes. When it comes to moderate Terence, can you go back up to the first one? Thank you. When it comes to low comfort and willingness, we really are highlighting a circumstance where change has occurred, and it's reflecting that there's a need for establishing a coalition of partners to lead this work and determine what are the needs, directions, and strategic priorities for the institution. And that could entail these suggested steps. And again, these are not the end-all be-all steps. Next slide, please. For those of you who found yourself in the 3 to 5 range of nascent comfort and willingness. It's many of the same elements as above about those working with your leadership to determine where is this going, but this reflects that you have some work already underway and there's some structure and resources already underway. It is important to build on that, right? The general theme here is build on what's already underway and really leverage the interest of those colleagues and leaders willing to participate and lead these efforts. Next slide, please. And the third one we'll discuss is moderate comfort willingness. Here, you're likely already engaged in equity work, and there's likely some resources and structures already in place. In this particular area, right, we're talking like the 5 to 6, 7 range on those scales. We really want to encourage you to figure out how can you advance this work, expand it, and include additional colleagues. And having those that are leading this work share, very much like how our colleague Ron Ferguson did, share their experiences and provide insights about their lessons learned, their missteps, their successes in advancing equity and student success can be instrumental in expanding and growing this work at your campus. Next slide, please. So again, we mentioned that there are several tools that we offer, and we've listed out a few here. At the end of this presentation, we will have links to the Equity by Design Toolkit, as well as the new Equity by Design data facilitation tool. Next slide, please. Again, I recognize we're flying through this really quick in the interest of time, but I want to jump us to the next part of this conversation.
And I did want to highlight, I've been dropping periodically in the chat. I've been putting that tool in as a PDF into the chat, and that exercise is available in there. So certainly welcome you if you want to rewatch this, or if you want to actually go through that. It's one of the key exercises within that tool. So hopefully you find that useful for assessing readiness.
Thank you, Terence. So shifting gears a little bit, we are returning to the apprehensions piece, the resistances and deflections. This is extraordinarily important because much of the work around navigating data-informed equity work or advancing data literacy is those who are facilitating and leading these conversations, but also those who are participating in this work. You have to be able to understand what are the apprehensions and how do you navigate them. And so to that end, in the Slido, we saw several of them, and we are listing out here just a number of common apprehensions and resistance. We're not going to cover all of these because that would take probably another 2 hours. But just quickly scan these, and a lot of these reflect what was said earlier in the Slido. What we'd like to do in just a moment is offer the space to our colleague Ron and Nicole to share what are some of the things that they want to highlight in terms of what are the key challenges and apprehensions, and offer some initial advice on how do you navigate those. So Nicole, we'll ask you to go first.
Thank you. So I'm just going to be touching on a few of those, of the long list that we came up with off the Slido, as well as the list that Priyank, and I'm sure there's others in your mind right now as well. But let's take a moment to start with the first one, which is feelings of being judged. What's really important in these conversations is to take the time to build some shared meaning around norms for interaction around data. I think that's incredibly important. And one of the first ones is assume positive intentions. Okay, so I say this, and my first thought is, Nicole, this is not you. I've always been sort of a, let's get down to brass tacks, let's talk about the data, let's move on. But I cannot stress enough how I have learned the importance of taking the time to assume positive intentions and talk about that with others when getting into these data conversations. You have to assume each faculty member, administrator, and staff person is acting out of a desire to improve teaching and learning, and that they are doing the best that they know how to do in that moment. This norm building is extremely important. That's how trust is built. The minute people believe that what you're saying is coming from a place of criticism and judgment, they can't hear you anymore. And any currency you have had in order to try to build on this conversation starts to just dwindle and disappear. So take the time, hold yourself rigorously accountable to assuming positive intentions, and hold others accountable as well by reframing statements. So let's say we're reviewing some data and someone looks and goes, looking at a course, this faculty member had training about this. She should already know how to do X, Y, and Z. Okay, that's extremely judgmental, right? I mean, whether it's intended to or not, it could be coming from a place of frustration. but it's not difficult to see how other people in the room would lose trust, become defensive, and frightened to share their own data if that's how they feel the conversation is going to go about them as well. So instead, reframe the conversation, reframe the statement. Say, you're right, the training did happen, but should we assume that a single training is going to lead to perfect application of a tactic or an instructional alternative? The same way that we expect faculty to go over things multiple times with students in order to ensure that they can apply the information, we have to assume we would need to do the same thing as well for our faculty. Also, did the training cover the different ways that this faculty member may teach? Because how you teach in a lab versus performing arts versus an applied hands-on course versus a lecture are all really different, right? And it can be difficult sometimes to take this broad concept that you hear once in a training and know how to apply it within your own individual context. Are there structural elements that could be causing a challenge to implementation of this particular tactic or instructional alternative? That takes the conversation away from why can't person do this, why can't she do this, and more about what is the process, what is the structure that we have, and how can we address that so that that faculty member can continue to do the best that they know how to do because they want to act out of a desire to improve teaching and learning. Assume positive intentions. That's again how we build trust. They cannot hear me if they do not trust me. And that's something to lay groundwork. Take the time to do that. Looking at small ends are a fact of life, especially when we start looking at different intersections of variables. When we're looking at race, but we're adding gender to it, that's bound to happen. But there are ways to address this. There are ways to work with this. Partner with your IR folks on campus. Have very open conversations. Aggregate where possible. Look at multiple sections over time for a single instructor. Look at multiple sections within a department, aggregating across instructors. Sometimes you need to take related departments and aggregate there if it means boosting your end. Because what you are looking for is the story. You're looking for the patterns. And that can occur once you start aggregating. And even if the numbers are still relatively small, it doesn't mean that the data has no value. It doesn't mean we should just disregard it and say, well, I can't do anything because this number isn't large enough. There's still a story there, and take the time to discover that story. The last one I'll look at is the statement, there's not much I can do to fix it. The focus here really is on a sense of agency that the instructors or staff members may have. They can feel really helpless and say, well, this is too big, this is too outside of me, I can't do anything about it. Help them rediscover their agency in this situation. Terence, can you go to the next slide? Okay, so here's just some examples of what to do when the focus of the data, the conversation shifts. Can you go again? Okay. If the conversation shifts from looking at the data to issues over which the team has no control, I'm sure we've all had that happen before. Acknowledge it. You're right. That is a real challenge for our students, but we don't have control over that. So given that we know that these challenges exist, which they absolutely do, what can we do in our classroom, in our service area that can alleviate the impact of this challenge? So it's saying, it's acknowledging that it exists, acknowledging that it's a concern, but refocusing on that agency. What is within your scope of control? What can you impact? Okay, Terence. Okay. If the conversation shifts to skills students should have acquired beforehand, I think we've all heard that a lot as well. Again, reframe, acknowledge and reframe. Well, we can't change what happened before they were in our classroom. We know that. But since we know that these skills are lacking, what can we do? How can we embed supports for those who lack prerequisite skills? Where can we build in skills to ladder into the material we need to cover now? And what about those students that have the skills? How can we leverage that in order to support students that don't have the skills? So again, working with those is a way to get to that sense of agency. What can you do? And last, sustained sentiments of helplessness and pessimism. Again, acknowledge the emotions they're feeling right now are valid, but show me just how much you care about the students, right? You wouldn't feel helpless if you didn't care about the students. The challenges the students face can seem really overwhelming. They are multifaceted. So Don't try to tackle everything, which I know we want to do because we care about the students. We want to try to fix so much at once. Just let's zero in on the aspects that we have control over in this moment. Where can you see yourself and the things you do in your classroom and services, and how can those alleviate the impact of some of those challenges? Okay, I'll turn over to Ron.
Thank you. I want to bring up a few things that really is about that messaging as well, to add to what Nicole just said. And the first and foremost thing, when I think about the relationship that's happening between the person sharing the data and the person receiving it, I think about how, you know, the certain kind of things that people might feel when they're given the information. And so the first thing that I think about from my colleagues that are in the faculty hallway or others that are receiving data is that the time that we are living in, you know, many faculty are on and off campus teaching in various modalities. They're doing new things they've never done before. They're often stressed out. There's so many factors in our lived experience that has changed in a year. And so we're giving a data not in a vacuum, right? We're dealing with the reality that people are going through things and they're super stressed out. Anecdotally, I can say there are people that are in our professions who love it, but that are stressed to the brink. And so I always try to, like our students, consider their experience when I'm sharing information. And so, you know, I think recognizing that just this is a season, and recognizing that in connection to that data, I think will both create that humanizing situation that we're all living in this together, and that we still need to do this work in spite of. But I recognize it and I want to account for that, right? And so, you know, the other factor is that this is not just that one more thing, because I think that's a fear of many faculty is, okay, what's the one more thing that I need to do to add to the list? And really that commitment being that this is something that we are incorporating into ostensibly what's good teaching or good, you know, continuous improvement of the work we do. And how do we say we're building this in, not on top of? Here's something that if you haven't heard it, it's what's going through people's mind. Even if you promise, even if you say we're not, there's a fear that maybe not you, but somebody along the line will use this data in a way that's going to evaluate or being punitive with the data. So I think getting that out of the way and saying not only that it won't, but trying to find ways to suggest how is this not going to ever be used? You know, you could talk about how the data is handled or what parameters you put to ensure that, you know, a new dean isn't going to come along, look up data and say, oh, I can't believe that, look at these numbers in this course or this course, depending on the situation or circumstances of the class or etc. But finding ways to say, yes, this is not going to be used for evaluation. It's not punitive. And here's how we as a system or as an institution are ensuring that happens. That those fears do need to be allayed, because honestly, and I've learned this from my work with HLC and others, if we're not, we need that trust that Nicole said. Without that trust, people they're gonna give you what you want. We'll just give you, but what we really need folks to be is honest, and we need to look at this stuff and be vulnerable. And if we don't have trust, I think it's going to limit the potential of using data. And last is we need to know where we're going. You know, I talked before about the promise we have of fulfilling a promise for students if we're using their stories and qualitative data. I think that there needs to be a conversation with those when there's data here. What do I do with this? Is this getting shelved somewhere, right, in a file? Is this being put into some executive summary that here's what we did? Or when we look at Equity 2030, when we look at the situation, where does this lie into our campus mission? Where does this align with various things we're trying to do, not just in your course or your situation, but really as a community? What are we trying to do? And so there, in my mind, the roadmap, you know, we say this a lot, we're building the plane as we fly it. You've probably heard that before. But for many people, that's not enough. That doesn't allow the sort of buy-in that we hope to have. We need to say, no, there is a next step. And we know this roadmap, and allowing that it not to be a mystery that there's some magical thing that's going to happen, i.e. equity down the line, but we're taking this and we're utilizing it for the next step and the next step. And notice I'm not being prescriptive in what those are, because in many cases, those are focused on where your campus is on the trajectory, right? So everybody in all the campuses we're at has a unique story and trajectory and student body, but it's recognizing the roadmap and are we sharing it with the various stakeholders? Those are just three things. And you know what it is? These are just aspects of good communication in general, right? The idea that we're humanizing those in front of us, we're seeking to listen to their fears and recognizing what questions they have, and showing them the full story and not sort of limiting sort of the scope that they might have. Because in some ways, just looking at data and saying do something might have a negative feeling, and we just want to just acknowledge that and move forward together.
Thank you, Ron and Nicole, for sharing your thoughts and advice and guidance. I want to remind for the audience that what we just heard about these apprehensions and deflections and resistance, while these sound like they're specific about equity work, those apprehensions and resistances are salient for data literacy, because we have to navigate those conversations as part of becoming data literate and data informed. So this is not squarely about equity work. This is about becoming more comfortable leveraging data. And part of that process is encountering, confronting, and navigating these elements. And when it comes to then translating the data into actual actions, we want to raise that flag of caution of jumping to solutions, right? This urgency to make something happen tomorrow. While we understand that, the challenge there is often those immediate solutions are more often than not completely student deficit based, that the solution is we fix this and the student will be fixed and then they'll do great. It doesn't look at us. It doesn't ask us to hold up the mirror to ourselves about our practices, policies, pedagogies, on what we can do different on our side. That being said, I want us to bring us to a close. And let me just say, I recognize that we went through part 2 really fast, and we will likely do a follow-up training on leveraging that toolkit. So Terence, I'm going to pass it to you for the closing, and then we will continue to stick around for additional conversation should our guests and colleagues like to stay and further discuss.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Shah. And for those of you that want to continue to hang out afterward, if you would like to engage in discussion, we certainly welcome that. But just wanted to outline a couple of opportunities that we have coming up. We know that we need to do a future data literacy training, right? This was really about laying that foundation for how to go about engaging in data and equity, right? How to bring people along with us. And we also have a competency series coming up that is focused on the equity scorecard. You can see that here on November 29th. And then for those of you that have been partaking in Equity by Design, we have our next campus team training that's going to really be centered around using data to do equity-minded analysis. So if you're part of your campus's Equity by Design efforts, you can see the date for that here. But we will communicate out to the broader system when we make the next data literacy training more broadly available through OEI's competency series. And then there's also some other opportunities that are available through the Network for Educational Development. If you haven't visited their site or if you're not familiar with them, go to the ASA newsletter. When we send out these materials, we'll make sure everything's hyperlinked in here as well for you to access through the net. But there's a plethora of opportunities that are available that speak to that. Okay, so you laid out all these challenges. What can I do? There's so many good resources that are available in here and trainings to engage in. So just a couple of other opportunities that are available. And now that we're closing, we want to welcome you to stay with us, engage with us afterward, but we also make ourselves available outside of this. You can reach out to Dr. Shah and I at any time. I can't speak for Nicole and Ron, but I'm sure that they would probably say the same. But we encourage folks to reach out to us, on a variety of different topics, right? We want to make ourselves available and accessible to people at the system office, to our campus colleagues, et cetera. But we always welcome that interaction and those relationships because we know this work is hard, right? And you're not at it alone. And I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to come to this webinar today and engage with us. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, stop recording. And if you want to talk, raise your hand. We'll allow you the permissions to do so.
Just one last piece as a closing remark. Thank you to our ASL interpreters. For the life of me, I don't know how you keep up with me when I start speaking fast. So we greatly appreciate your presence and your time and your hard work. Thank you for being with us.